2 years back, I reread the Harry Potter series. This was the first reread since I was a child, so it was a pleasant surprise to find out that, yeah, these books really are that good. Yes, there are plot issues. One issue in particular is the point of this whole video, but it's still a magical ride full of emotion and clever humor, intriguing settings, great characters, and a riveting story. Another thing I was both pleased and sorry to discover was this strangeness of Ron's character. Growing up, I always thought Ron was funny, but as I got older, I also saw how useless he tended to be, especially in the movies, and he also tended to be quite cruel. This time around, I saw clearly the things that J.K. Rowling didn't dare do with this character, which consequently led to why Ron is a somewhat disliked and useless character, and also why Ron and Hermione don't seem to work as a couple for a lot of readers. Disclaimer, I pick Harry over Ron in a relationship with Hermione. Hermione and Harry have a much calmer, respectful relationship, and you may rave on about passion and such, but I'll tend to agree with Eleanor from Sense and Sensibility that a sensible character wins out in the end in the contest for partnership. Those comments Rowling would make in the books about Ron missing when it was just the two of them also always fell kind of short for me. Sure, the Hermione-Harry relationship is not as humorous, but there's no reason it couldn't evolve to that when they got more comfortable with each other. To get to the point of this video, I will be talking about Ron's role in the story, his lack of development, and how that development could have been saved by a few key changes, particularly after book 4. These changes would also enable Ron and Hermione to be a more healthy, interesting couple. So let's begin with looking at Ron throughout the 7 books. In the first 3 books, Ron works very well within the narrative. He's the jokester, but also quite intelligent, as shown through his skill in chess, and he's the one who knows all the things about the magical world that you can't read in a book. He has lived it, so he knows it. The last time we see this is in book 7, where Ron knows about Beetles and the Bard and Hermione doesn't, because it's a children's book she has never thought to pick up, however consequential it is to the wizarding community and culture. So Ron is the wizarding community in their little trinity. In book 1, he is the pureblood friend who can explain magical stuff. He's comfortable within the wizard world and shows what a normal wizard life looks like. He's a loyal friend who extends his knowledge to Harry and makes sure that he feels at home. He's a bit of a jokester, but his humor has consequence. His critiques of Hermione are not unwarranted, and between her arrogant cleverness and Harry's somewhat imbecile bravery, Ron stands as the more reasonable person in the bunch, the one who realizes the repercussions of all that they are doing. This can at times make him seem cowardly, when in fact it's mostly common sense remarks. This is actually a crucial element to the trio, and one that is played well on in the 3 first books, and to some extent the 4th and 5th. Ron plays several crucial roles in the story, particularly with the plant snare and the chessboard at the end. In book 2, we further get the sense that Ron's family is becoming Harry's. Ron extends the wizard life to Harry as if it was no great deed at all. The reader forgets this too. How many people do you know that are this generous? Some are fortunate enough to have a friend with this kind of welcoming family that you can sort of just merge into and become a part of, but many people are not that fortunate. We forget that it's not easy to share your family, especially with one of the most famous wizards of your time. Ron adds another person who can outshine him to the mix, and he already feels left out in his own family. His own generosity becomes his bane. In book 2, Ron takes center stage. His and Harry's friendship deepens and broadens. Their personalities start to solidify, and both of them become a bit more snarky. They start to have that male bond you see between 2 close male friends, you know. It's a bromance, a sacred bond of humor and trust and loyalty. And Ron shows his true colors here. Once Hermione is petrified, he is willing to go along with anything. He may not like the spiders, but he damn well went into that forest anyway. I, as someone who has a phobia for frogs, can really relate to him. So I would say, brave, Ron, brave. He also threatened their slick teacher into entering the Chamber of Secrets, and he didn't hesitate to go in there himself. The only reason Harry is alone in the final standoff to save Ginny is because Ron is forced out of the climax by a rock slide. In book 3, Ron and Hermione start to bicker. Ron is becoming lazier and he's a bit difficult at times, but nothing that's truly horrendous or that outshines his better traits. To be fair, Hermione is quite annoying about protecting her cat as well. Ron doesn't do much in this book as in previous ones because he's left out of the 3rd act due to a broken leg, but he does show his loyalty and, somewhat common sense at this point. In book 4, Ron starts realizing that girls exist. This is obviously a bit confusing. Both he and Harry struggle with it, but Ron the most as he begins to find an interest in Hermione that perhaps he doesn't quite understand or know how to handle. They're growing up and these are confusing years. At the same time, he starts to have these self-esteem issues due to Harry's presence in the Triwizard Tournament. I think this plays out well in book 4, and eventually they are able to end the argument without many words, but a lot of unspoken understanding, and I really like that scene. The Hermione thing ends less well, but we'll get to the stalling of this plot thread later. In book 5, we have Dumbledore's army, and Ron shows a great deal of vigor and enthusiasm, but not much more. He doesn't do a lot of clever things or great magic. His relentlessness during the final battle is the most noteworthy thing, in which he keeps his cool and is willing to sacrifice his own life for his friends. However, he is not spectacular with spells or coming up with plans. In book 6, Ron is just completely unbearable. He is mean to Hermione and refuses to deal with his self-esteem issues on the Quidditch field and in the classroom. The same thing goes for book 7, in which his angry jealousy is somewhat resolved, but not his lack of skill or self-esteem. And frankly, I think it's a mess. So, what are the underlying themes of Ron's character arc, if you can say so? Let's look at the composition of his character and the struggles that he goes through. He is the younger, unwanted son, and the brother to some pretty amazing people with great powers. This creates the fundament for Ron's struggle with self-esteem, particularly when Harry comes in and he's the chosen one, and in the Triwizard Tournament, and etc, etc. He is the jokester. He has a strong common sense, which unfortunately is not expanded on in the later books and develops into cynicism, bleakness, and anger, instead of logic, rationality, and wisdom. He fears that the girl he loves won't love him back because there's a greater guy in the room. Instead of trying to outdo the greater guy, he slumps into resentment and hatred of his own bad luck and the unfairness of the world. I'll take a look at the composition of all these struggles, how they fail in the narrative, and how they could have been played for brilliance and have made for a great, lovable, memorable character. First, self-esteem. There's a great potential for narrative development in this theme alone, and it's the one that carried the strongest potential for Ron. Due to his brother's greatness, he slumped into mediocrity and unconsciously began not to try, because it's easier to pretend you could be great if you don't do anything to begin with. This position strengthens as Ginny becomes stronger. It seems that for every empowerment that her character receives, Ron tries a little less. He doesn't really do his homework. When he does, it's unenthusiastically. He doesn't really care about anything, except Quidditch and Hermione and Harry. And this apathy makes grounds for his less than stellar academic achievements later in the school years. As a side note, it's interesting how we can talk so much about female characters who are, all about a male character, but ignore that this is also true for Ron, except he's all about a female character. Much of what he does is bound up on his feelings for Hermione. Ron goes to show that a male character being bound up on a female character is no more fulfilling than a female character who is bound up on a male. Ron becomes more and more angry throughout the books, and rightly so. Unfortunately, Ron's fate is not uncommon. People shrink from their own potential all the time, from fear of failing and not being loved by the people dear to them. And as a result, they amount to little and are overshone by better, more hardworking people like Neville and Luna. This creates bitterness and resentment. In Ron's case, it's thrown at Harry and Hermione and is probably also the cause of why Ron lacks the balls to do anything about his attraction to Hermione. By the 2 last books of the series, Ron is just an asshole, and I question why Harry and Hermione still hang out with him. He never amounts to anything, and his future is uncertain. Apparently, he enters into the trickster shop that Fred and George created, and this is just so sad. Hooray, you took over the spot of your dead older brother and will always live in his shadow as you partner up with his twin. Congratulations. If this was played more seriously and consciously by J.K. Rowling, I would say Ron's fate is actually interesting and horrifying. It could be an interesting take if that was what you wanted to do. However, there's little sympathy for Ron in the story, little acknowledgement of his flawed development, and that this isn't a story that deserves the happy ending that he gets in the end, which is one reason the ending prologue falls so flat. You just don't believe that Hermione would accept the guy that Ron is in the end, even if she fell in love with the guy that he used to be. This lack of acknowledgement of his failure to develop is where the narrative problem begins. You can have a flawed character who does not get better, but if you don't handle that situation well and instead slap an irrational happy ending on top of it, people aren't going to like it. 2. Jokester and common sense. While jokesters may seem a bit basic or dumb, they're typically not. There's a difference between being just a fool or coming up with witty remarks. The latter is what Ron does, and it actually requires insight into things. It requires the strength to bear the horrors of the world with lightness. Intelligence and good humor are great character traits, but as Ron does not hone his intelligence, he becomes less insightful and less good-humored, and his humor becomes more cruel. Ron's common sense and humor could have been developed into strengths if J.K. Rowling had let Ron overcome his struggles with self-defeat and dare to actually try. Ron would open his mind to things, and while he might have had some dark moments of struggling with his old demons, he would ultimately move in a more cheerful direction in which he realized the unfairness of the world, but also had the humor to bear it and thus the strength to see the bright side of things and try to change it. Because he wouldn't have descended into anger, he would have remained the voice of reason within the group, the one who pointed out the idiocy or suicidalness of a plan, the one who used his own understanding of wizard history and culture to their advantage. Ron may not agree with the anti-Muggle thoughts of many purebloods, but he has been surrounded by those thoughts his entire life, and that could have been useful during Book 7 when the three are on the run. Having an eye into the enemy's mind is always a plus side, and in this way you wouldn't just have Harry's random looks into Voldemort's thoughts. 3. Fears of losing the girl. I don't think I need to delve much into this. Ron's self-esteem issues lead to him doing nothing with regards to Hermione, but his attraction to Hermione shuts off the possibility of having any real relationship with other girls, which would give him the needed experience to woo Hermione. Instead of doing something, he becomes angry at her and Harry. Yes, he dates that chick in Book 6, but it's safe to say that that's just physical and that he doesn't become much better at wooing girls from it. 4. The stalling of Hermione and Ron's relationship. Ron and Hermione should have started dating in Book 5. Not only because the fact that such an infatuation is just unlikely to go unresolved for so long in as tight a group as theirs, it also just doesn't work for the narrative. It feels stagnant. And having them start dating in Book 5 would have left so much room for developing their relationship and showing their good and bad times, instead of just a quick kiss in the heat of battle and a glimpse of their future, which is just, frankly, untrustworthy. Personally, I feel that the stalling of their romantic relationship also seriously impacts their friendship in the later books. This passion and friction between them makes it hard for them to have proper conversations, and they end up bickering more often than not. That's a pretty tiring relationship both for the reader and Harry rightfully scorns them for it. Another quick side note. As a lot of you know, J.K. Rowling made a public statement where she took a new look at the relationships in her books, and she didn't say that Harry and Hermione would have made a better couple, but that there was potential for it to be better. She then acknowledged that Ron and Hermione would need counseling, and she said, "Oh, maybe she and Ron will be all right with a bit of counseling, you know. I wonder what happens at Wizard Marriage Counseling. They'll probably be fine. He needs to work on his self-esteem issues, and she needs to work on being a little less critical." And while I agree with this statement, I also think it's important to remember that much of their bickering ultimately comes from frustrated attraction and longing, so it's unfair to judge their potential relationship on that. This is only one reason I would have liked to see Ron and Hermione get together earlier, so we would get to see the true conflicts in their relationship. And also, aren't we past the point where there's anything wrong with counseling? Like, if you have an issue, go see a counselor. If you can't fix it yourself, like, that's fine. That doesn't mean that your relationship is doomed or necessarily bad. Stigma. So to further underline my point of how badly structured this relationship is, I'd like to point out that the end of her quote about how he has self-esteem issues and she needs to work on being less critical, those are both issues that ought to have been dealt with in the books. Maybe not to full completion, but like more than they were. Okay, so now we get to the juicy part. What could have been done to fix Ron's character and his arc?